The mysterious encounter. The neon lights flickered erratically in the crowded space station's main hub, casting shadows that danced like ghosts across the metal walls. The air smelled of burnt circuits and exotic spices, a mix of cultures from 1,000 planets. It was a place where rules were optional, and trust was a rare commodity. James stepped into the tavern, his boots clicking softly against the floor. He looked out of place, like a lone wolf wandering into a den of predators. His human frame was lean but sturdy, his eyes scanning the room with a calm confidence. Most patrons ignored him. Humans weren't particularly rare, but a few alien eyes lingered on him, filled with curiosity and suspicion. Sitting at a corner table, Silara tilted her head, her golden eyes narrowing as she observed the newcomer. She was a Korovian, a rare feathered species known for their beauty and fierce independence. Her iridescent feathers shimmered under the dim light, shifting between shades of blue and green as she moved. Korovians were rarely seen in places like this, preferring the solitude of their homeworld. Yet here she was, sipping a glowing blue drink, her gaze fixed on the human. James made his way to the bar, ordering a drink in a language most in the room didn't understand. The bartender, a slimy green creature with too many arms, handed him a glass without a word. James turned and leaned against the bar, his eyes meeting Silara's across the room. He gave her a small nod, a gesture of acknowledgement. Silara's feathers flared slightly, a reflexive reaction to her surprise. Most people avoided making eye contact with a Korovian. It was considered rude, even dangerous. Yet this human had done it so casually, as if he didn't care about the unspoken rules. Before she could decide how to react, James picked up his drink and walked over to her table. He moved with a deliberate ease, like someone who had seen too much to be fazed by a room full of strangers. Silara watched him with a mix of curiosity and caution. "Mind if I join you?" James asked, his voice steady but not overconfident. Silara studied him for a moment before gesturing to the empty seat across from her. "You're either very brave or very foolish," she said, her voice soft but sharp. "Maybe a little of both," James replied, sitting down. "But I couldn't help noticing you seemed out of place here. Like me." Silara raised an eyebrow, or what passed for one among her kind. "And what makes you think that?" "Well," James said, leaning back slightly. "For one, Korovians aren't exactly known for frequenting stations like this. And two, you've been watching me since I walked in." Her feathers flared again, this time in irritation. "You're observant. I'll give you that. But observation can be a dangerous habit." James chuckled softly. "Danger's part of the job." "And what job is that?" she asked, her golden eyes narrowing. James took a sip of his drink, his gaze never leaving hers. "Let's just say I'm a traveler. I go where I'm needed." Silara tilted her head again, her feathers settling. There was something unusual about this human, something she couldn't quite place. He seemed too calm, too comfortable in a place that thrived on chaos. It was almost as if he belonged here more than she did. Before she could press him further, the tavern's lights flickered again, this time more violently. A low hum filled the air, followed by a crackling voice over the station's intercom. "Attention, all patrons. Station lockdown initiated. Please remain in your current locations until further notice." The hum grew louder, vibrating through the floor. Conversations around the tavern fell silent as everyone looked around nervously. Lockdowns were never a good sign. Silara's feathers bristled as she glanced toward the entrance. "What's going on?" she muttered, half to herself. James stood up, his expression unreadable. "Doesn't sound like a routine security check," he said. "You might want to stay close." Silara's eyes snapped back to him. "And why would I do that?" "Because I have a feeling this isn't just a random lockdown," James said, his voice low. "And if I'm right, you're better off with me than on your own." Silara hesitated. She didn't trust him. She barely trusted anyone. But something about his tone made her pause. He spoke with the certainty of someone who had been in situations like this before, and as much as she hated to admit it, he was probably right. "Fine," she said, standing up. Her feathers glimmered faintly as she adjusted her cloak. "But if this is some kind of trick—" "It's not," James interrupted, a small smile playing on his lips. "Trust me, I don't have time for tricks." Together, they moved toward the back of the tavern, away from the prying eyes of the other patrons. The tension in the air was palpable, and Silara couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much bigger. As they slipped into the shadows, the tavern door creaked open, and a group of armored figures stepped inside. Their faces were hidden behind helmets, but their intentions were clear. They weren't here for drinks. James glanced at Silara, his expression serious now. "Stay close," he whispered. "Things are about to get interesting." And with that, the mysterious encounter became a dangerous game of survival. The strange bond. The metallic corridors of the station echoed with distant alarms as James led Silara through the maze-like passages. The dim lights overhead flickered, and every shadow seemed to twist with menace. The group of armored hunters had entered the tavern moments after they left, and now the quiet hum of pursuit was in the air. Silara kept pace, her sharp golden eyes scanning their surroundings. She didn't trust James. Why should she? Humans were unpredictable, and this one seemed to carry secrets like a cloak. Yet something about him made her hesitate to part ways. It wasn't just the hunters or the station-wide lockdown. It was the way he moved, deliberate yet instinctive, as though he knew this station better than most who lived here. "You've done this before," she said finally, breaking the tense silence. James glanced over his shoulder, his lips curling into a faint grin. "Done what? Run for my life? More times than I care to count." "That wasn't what I meant." Her feathers ruffled slightly, shimmering faintly as the low light caught them. "You seem prepared, like you expected this." James slowed as they approached a junction, holding up a hand to stop her. He peered around the corner, his body tense but controlled. "Expecting trouble is part of the job," he replied. "But this? No, I didn't expect this." "Then what is your job?" Silara pressed, lowering her voice. He turned back to her, his blue eyes catching the faint glow of the station lights. "Let's just say I fix problems. And right now, the problem is getting you out of here alive." "Me?" Silara's feathers flared in indignation. "I don't need saving." James raised an eyebrow, but didn't argue. Instead, he gestured for her to follow him down the left corridor. She reluctantly complied, her taloned feet clicking softly on the metal floor. The air grew colder as they moved deeper into the station. This sector was less populated, the walls bearing the scars of neglect and occasional battle. The hum of pursuit had faded, but James didn't relax. He moved with the confidence of someone who knew danger wasn't always loud. Finally, they reached a small maintenance hatch. James knelt down, prying it open with a small device he pulled from his jacket. Silara watched, her feathers twitching with impatience. "This doesn't feel random," she said after a moment. "The hunters. The lockdown. Someone's after you." "Not me," James corrected as the hatch opened with a soft hiss. He looked up at her, his expression unreadable. "They're after you." Silara blinked, her feathers shimmering in shades of green and gold. "That's impossible. No one here knows who I am." "Someone does." James climbed into the hatch and offered her a hand. She hesitated, then ignored it, climbing in on her own. He shrugged, muttering something under his breath as he secured the hatch behind them. The maintenance tunnel was narrow, forcing them to move single file. The walls were lined with cables and pipes, and the air smelled of ozone and grease. James moved ahead, his movements quick and sure. Silara followed, her mind racing. "How do you know they're after me?" she asked, her voice low. "Because," James said without looking back, "you're the only one in that tavern who stood out. Carovians don't show up in places like this unless they're running from something or hiding something." Silara stopped walking, her feathers bristling. "You don't know anything about me." James turned, his gaze steady. "I know enough." You're not here by accident. And those hunters, they weren't looking for a random target. She opened her beak to argue but closed it again. He wasn't wrong. She was hiding something. Something she couldn't afford to share, not even with a strange human who had, for reasons unknown, decided to help her. Before she could respond, a low rumble shook the tunnel. Dust and small bits of debris rained down, and the lights flickered ominously. "Looks like they found us," James muttered, picking up his pace. "Found you," Silara corrected, but she followed him nonetheless. The tunnel led to a small, abandoned control room. James slid the door shut behind them, locking it with another of his gadgets. The room was cramped, filled with outdated equipment, and a single, dimly glowing console. "Not much of a hiding spot," Silara said, glancing around. "It's not for hiding," James replied, moving to the console. "It's for buying time." He began typing on the console, his fingers moving with practiced speed. Silara watched him, her frustration growing. She hated being out of control, and this entire situation was spiraling faster than she could manage. "Why are you helping me?" she asked finally. James paused, his fingers hovering over the console. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he turned to face her, his expression unusually serious. "Because I've seen what happens when people like those hunters get what they want," he said quietly. "And I don't want to see it happen again." Before Silara could respond, the console beeped and a holographic map of the station flickered to life. Red dots swarmed across the map, converging on their location. "We've got company," James said, grabbing a small device from his jacket. He tossed it to Silara, who caught it with a sharp talon. "What's this?" she asked, examining the device. "A shield generator," James replied, "just in case things get messy." "Messy?" Silara's feathers flared. "You mean they're going to?" The door shook violently, cutting her off. Muffled voices and the unmistakable sound of weapons charging echoed from the other side. James grinned, pulling a sleek, black pistol from his belt. "Looks like it's time to see how good Korovians are in a fight." Silara's golden eyes narrowed. "Better than humans." "We'll see about that," James said, his grin widening. The door exploded inward, and the room was filled with chaos. And in that chaos, Silara began to realize this human wasn't ordinary. Not by a long shot. The wild chase. The explosion sent shockwaves through the cramped control room, throwing Silara and James to the floor. Sparks rained down from the ceiling as smoke curled into the air, obscuring the advancing silhouettes of armored hunters. James rolled onto his back, raising his sleek black pistol. The weapon hummed with energy as he fired 3 quick shots. The blasts lit up the smoky room, striking the first figure square in the chest. The hunter collapsed with a metallic thud, but the others pressed forward, their helmets reflecting the flickering lights. Silara's feathers flared in alarm, and her sharp talons dug into the floor as she scrambled for cover. Her kind were known for their agility, not combat. But this was different. The hunters weren't just after her. They wanted the secret she carried. "Stay low," James barked, taking aim again. The hunters returned fire, their weapons spitting bursts of plasma that sizzled through the air. One bolt struck the console, and it erupted in a shower of sparks. The room plunged into darkness, save for the glowing tips of the enemy weapons. Silara's golden eyes adjusted quickly, catching James as he lunged for the wall. He slammed his palm against a hidden panel, and a section of the floor hissed open, revealing a narrow escape shaft. "Move," he shouted, shoving her toward it. For a split second, Silara hesitated. Her instincts screamed to trust no one, but the urgency in James's voice overrode her doubt. She leaped into the shaft, her feathers brushing against the cool, metal walls as she slid down. Moments later, James followed, sealing the hatch behind them. The shaft spit them out into another corridor, this one darker and more decrepit than the last. The walls were lined with corroded pipes, and the faint hum of the station's core rumbled beneath their feet. Silara spun on James, her feathers puffing up in agitation. "What now?" "They're tracking us." James wiped a streak of soot from his face, his expression calm despite the chaos. "They're not tracking us. They're tracking you." Her feathers rippled, shifting from green to a deep indigo. "And how would you know that?" "Because," James said, pulling a small device from his jacket, "this was embedded in your cloak." He held up a thin, metallic tag, no larger than a fingernail. Silara's eyes widened. She hadn't even noticed it. "That's impossible," she hissed. "No one's been close enough to tag me." James shrugged, tossing the device to the ground and crushing it under his boot. Apparently someone was. Before she could argue further, the distant sound of boots echoed down the corridor. James grabbed her arm, his grip firm, but not aggressive. "We can argue later," he said. "Right now, we run." They sprinted down the corridor, their footsteps muffled by the layers of grime coating the floor. The hunters' voices grew louder, barking commands in a language Silara couldn't recognize. James, however, seemed to understand. His expression hardened as he pushed her toward another hatch. "They're calling for reinforcements," he muttered. "We don't have much time." The hatch led into a massive maintenance bay, its ceiling towering high above them. The room was filled with abandoned equipment, rusted drones, deactivated security turrets, and a towering pile of scrap metal. Dim, flickering lights cast eerie shadows across the space. James scanned the room quickly, his eyes locking onto a sleek, black transport pod resting near the far wall. It looked out of place among the wreckage, its surface clean and polished. "That'll do," he said, nodding toward the pod. Silara followed his gaze, her feathers twitching. "You expect me to trust that thing? It could be a trap." "Everything in this station could be a trap," James said, already moving toward the pod. "But if you've got a better idea, I'm all ears." Before she could respond, the hunters burst into the maintenance bay, their weapons raised. James cursed under his breath and pulled out a small device from his jacket, a sleek, cylindrical gadget with glowing blue lines. "What's that?" Silara asked, her voice sharp. "A distraction," James said, tossing the device toward the hunters. The gadget hit the ground and exploded in a burst of blinding light and deafening noise. The hunters stumbled, their visors flickering as they tried to recalibrate. James didn't waste a second, grabbing Silara's arm and pulling her toward the pod. They reached it just as the hunters began to recover. James slammed his hand against the pod's control panel, and the door slid open with a soft hiss. He shoved Silara inside and followed, sealing the door behind them. The interior of the pod was surprisingly sleek, with glowing blue controls and a faint hum of power. James slid into the pilot's seat, his fingers dancing across the controls. "Strap in," he said, his voice tight. "This is going to be rough." Silara barely had time to sit before the pod lurched forward, its engines roaring to life. The hunters fired after them, their plasma bolts ricocheting off the pod's reinforced hull. James navigated the narrow corridors with precision, the pod weaving through the labyrinthine passages of the station. Silara clung to her seat, her feathers bristling as the pod narrowly avoided a collision with a massive support beam. "Do you even know where you're going?" she demanded. "More or less," James replied, grinning despite the tension. "Trust me." The pod burst into an open hangar bay, and James slammed the controls, sending the pod skidding to a halt. He jumped out, pulling Silara with him. "What now?" she asked, exasperated. James pointed to a small battered ship parked in the corner of the hangar. Its engines were humming faintly, ready to go. "Now," he said, "we get out of here." As they sprinted toward the ship, the hunters entered the hangar, their weapons blazing. Plasma bolts streaked past them, but James didn't falter. He reached the ship first, slamming his hand on the access panel. The ramp lowered, and he pulled Silara inside. The ship's engines roared as James took the controls. The hunters fired desperately, but it was too late. The ship lifted off, blasting out of the hangar and into the cold void of space. Silara sank into a seat, her feathers shimmering as she caught her breath. She looked at James, who was grinning like a man who had just beaten impossible odds. "This isn't over," she said, her voice low. James glanced at her, his grin fading. "No," he said quietly. "It's just beginning." The stars outside blurred as the ship jumped to hyperspace, leaving the station, and its dangers, far behind. For now. The revelation. A ship hummed softly as it streaked through hyperspace, the swirling blue void outside casting faint shadows across the cramped interior. Silara sat in silence, her golden eyes fixed on James as he adjusted the controls. She could feel the tension in her feathers, the unspoken questions weighing heavy in the air. Finally, she couldn't hold back any longer. "You knew," she said, her voice cutting through the quiet. "You knew they were after me from the start." James leaned back in his seat, letting out a slow breath. "I had my suspicions." Her feathers flared in anger, shimmering between shades of green and violet. "You don't just stumble into suspicions like that, human. You knew something about me, something you're not telling me." James turned to face her, his blue eyes calm but sharp. "You're right," he admitted. "I knew you were carrying something important, something dangerous. And I wasn't the only one who noticed." Stilara's claws gripped the edge of her seat. "What do you mean by carrying?" "I have nothing." Before she could finish, the ship's sensors beeped, and the console flickered to life. James frowned, scanning the readout. "We've got company," he muttered. Silara moved to his side, her feathers brushing against the back of his chair. The console displayed a single ship emerging from hyperspace behind them, sleek and angular with weapons fully armed. It wasn't just pursuing them, it was hunting them. James tightened his grip on the controls. "Hang on. This might get bumpy." The ship lurched as he threw it into a sharp dive, narrowly avoiding a blast of plasma that streaked past their hull. Silara braced herself, her talons digging into the floor. "You call this an escape plan?" "It's better than getting vaporized," James shot back, steering the ship into a series of erratic maneuvers. The pursuing vessel was relentless, matching their every move. Silara could feel her pulse quickening, her instincts screaming at her to act. But what could she do in the face of such overwhelming firepower? As if sensing her turmoil, James glanced at her. "There's something you're not telling me, too," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos. "Something about why they want you so badly." Silara hesitated, her feathers rippling with unease. She had spent her entire life guarding her secrets, even from her own kind. Trust didn't come easily, especially not with the human she had just met. But the look in James's eyes, the determination, the urgency, made her falter. "They're not after me," she said finally. "They're after what I'm meant to become." James's brow furrowed. "What you're meant to become? You're going to have to explain that." Before she could respond, the ship rocked violently, and alarms blared. A direct hit had grazed their rear engine, sending sparks flying through the cabin. James gritted his teeth, wrestling with the controls. "Whatever this is," he growled, "we're not going to survive it unless you give me something to work with." Silara closed her eyes, her feathers dimming as she struggled to find the words. "My species is unique," she began, her voice low but steady. "Our biology is different. Every few generations, one of us is born with a potential, a genetic anomaly that makes us a bridge between our kind and others." James raised an eyebrow. "A bridge?" "It's hard to explain," she admitted. "But we are chosen. Our DNA becomes something new, something capable of unlocking abilities far beyond what most species can comprehend. When it happens, our people call it the awakening." "And you're the chosen one this time?" James asked, glancing at her. She nodded reluctantly. "Yes, but it's not just my people who know about the awakening. Others, factions, empires, scientists, they've been waiting for it, watching. They want to control it, to use me as a weapon or a tool." James let out a low whistle. No wonder they sent hunters. You're not just a target. You're a prize. Silara's feathers bristled, her golden eyes narrowing. I'm not a prize. I'm a person. Fair enough, James said. But if they get their hands on you, I doubt they'll see it that way. The pursuing ship fired again, and James swerved hard to avoid the blast. The cabin rattled, and warning lights flashed across the console. He grimaced. We can't outrun them like this. I need you to trust me. Silara tilted her head, her feathers flaring slightly. Trust you? After everything you've kept from me. James shot her a look. I didn't exactly see you volunteering your life story earlier. Look, I don't know what you're capable of. But if you're as important as you say you are, now would be a great time to prove it. Silara hesitated, her talons flexing. She hated how right he was, but she also hated the idea of exposing herself further. Still, the alternative was capture, or worse. I can do one thing, she said, stepping toward the console. But it's risky. James grinned despite the tension. Risky is better than dead. Silara placed a taloned hand on the console, her feathers glowing faintly as she focused. A strange melodic hum filled the cabin, and the ship's lights flickered. James's eyes widened as the sensors went haywire, the displays shifting into incomprehensible patterns. What are you? Hold on. Silara interrupted, her voice strained. The hum grew louder, resonating through the ship as the pursuing vessel closed in. Then, without warning, the energy burst outward, enveloping both ships in a dazzling wave of light. The enemy ship veered off course, its weapons powering down as its systems overloaded. James blinked in astonishment as the enemy ship drifted helplessly into the void. What was that? Silara slumped against the console, her feathers dimming. A pulse, she said, her voice weak. It's part of what I can do. I disrupted their systems. James stared at her for a moment, then shook his head with a laugh. Remind me never to get on your bad side. She managed a faint smile, though exhaustion weighed heavy on her. You wouldn't survive it. As James set the ship back on course, the tension in the cabin eased slightly, but the questions lingered, unspoken yet unavoidable. Whatever Silara had done, it was only the beginning of what she was capable of. And James couldn't shake the feeling that the galaxy wasn't ready for what was coming next. Neither, he suspected, were they. The egg's emergence. The ship drifted in the quiet expanse of deep space, far from pursuing ships or crowded stations. The hum of the engines was steady, a calming rhythm against the tension that lingered in the air. Silara sat in the co-pilot's seat, her feathers dull, their iridescence reduced to a faint shimmer. She had spent herself with that energy pulse, and it showed. James glanced at her as he adjusted the ship's course. You look like you've been hit by a solar storm. Silara gave a weak chuckle, though her golden eyes remained serious. Using my abilities takes more out of me than you think, especially now. Now, James raised an eyebrow, curious. What's so special about now? She didn't answer immediately, instead staring out at the stars. After a long pause, she said quietly, because something inside me is waking up. Something bigger than me. James tilted his head, watching her carefully. That awakening thing you talked about earlier. Yes, Silara whispered. It's accelerating, faster than it should. James leaned back in his chair, considering this. Let me guess, it has something to do with why the hunters came after you, doesn't it? Silara nodded, her talons tapping lightly against the edge of the console. The awakening isn't just a personal transformation. It's a catalyst. When it begins, it sends out signals, frequencies most species can't even detect. But those who can, they come, and they're never far behind. James let out a low whistle, running a hand through his hair. So we're basically flying around with a homing beacon for every dangerous faction in the galaxy. Essentially, Silara said, her voice tinged with regret. I didn't choose this, James. It's It's just what I am. He softened at her tone, sighing. I get it. I'm not blaming you. But we need a plan. Because right now, running isn't enough. Before Zilara could respond, the ship suddenly shuddered, as if something had struck it from within. The lights flickered, and the console flashed warnings, though no external threats appeared on the sensors. James shot her a look. Please tell me you didn't just short-circuit the ship. Zilara shook her head, her feathers flaring in alarm. That wasn't me. Another tremor rocked the ship, this time accompanied by a deep, resonant hum that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Zilara clutched her chest, her breath hitching. Zilara. James was on his feet in an instant, reaching for her. What's happening? I don't know. She gasped, her feathers flaring wildly, as if caught in an invisible storm. It's inside me. Suddenly, she doubled over, collapsing to the floor. James caught her just before she hit, his arms steady despite the panic rising in his chest. Her body glowed faintly, an iridescent light spreading from her chest to her wings. Zilara, talk to me, he urged. What's going on? She opened her beak to speak, but no words came. Instead, the glow intensified, filling the small cabin with an almost blinding light. James shielded his eyes, but he didn't let go of her. The hum grew louder, reverberating through the ship like a heartbeat. Then, as quickly as it began, the light dimmed. The hum faded into silence, leaving only the sound of the ship's engines. James blinked, his vision adjusting, and looked down at Zilara. She was unconscious, her breathing shallow but steady. But that wasn't what caught his attention. His gaze fell to her abdomen, where something extraordinary had appeared. A large, translucent egg, glowing faintly with the same iridescent light that had enveloped her moments ago. What the hell? James muttered, staring in disbelief. The egg pulsed softly, its surface shimmering like liquid glass. Within, a faint shadow moved, something alive and growing. James felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't just an egg, it was something far more significant. Before he could process what had happened, Zilara stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She looked up at him, her gaze hazy but aware. James, she murmured. The egg. It's begun. What's begun? He asked, his voice low. What is this thing? It's the awakening's result, she said weakly, her voice barely above a whisper. The egg is a vessel, a culmination of my species' evolution. It holds the potential to unite worlds or destroy them. James stared at her, his mind racing. You're saying this thing could be a weapon. It's more than a weapon, she said, her golden eyes locking onto his. It's life, it's change, and it's vulnerable. James stood, pacing the small cabin. And now everyone who's after you is going to come after this thing too. Great. Zilara tried to sit up, but her strength failed her. You have to help me, James. If the wrong hands get hold of it, the galaxy won't survive. James stopped pacing, turning to face her. The weight of her words hung in the air, heavy and inescapable. He didn't fully understand what was happening, but he didn't need to. He could see it in her eyes. The urgency, the fear, and the faintest glimmer of hope. All right, he said finally, his voice firm. We'll protect it. But first, we need to figure out where to go. Somewhere safe. Zilara shook her head. There's no safe place. Only forward. James frowned. Forward? To where? To my people, she said. They'll know what to do. James hesitated. And what if they don't? What if they're the wrong hands? Zilara's gaze hardened, her feathers flaring slightly despite her exhaustion. Then we'll make sure they don't get the chance. James nodded slowly, a hint of a smile tugging at his lips. Now that's the kind of answer I can work with. As the ship sailed deeper into uncharted space, the egg pulsed softly in its cradle, a silent promise of what was to come. And in the quiet of the cabin, James couldn't shake the feeling that their journey had only just begun, and that the choices they made would change the galaxy forever. The galactic pursuit. The stars outside blurred as the ship hurtled through hyperspace, its battered engines straining against the relentless pressure of the chase. James had barely caught his breath since Stellara had laid the glowing egg, and the implications of what it meant were gnawing at him. He stole a glance at her. She sat slumped in the co-pilot's chair, her feathers dim but her gaze sharp, locked on the egg cradled in a containment field she'd hastily rigged. The egg pulsed faintly, almost like it was alive. No, not just alive. Aware. James broke the silence. That thing. He gestured toward the egg with a flick of his hand, his voice strained. Whatever's in it, it's broadcasting, isn't it? Stellara didn't look at him. It's not something I can control. The awakening creates ripples, James, like waves in water. Everyone who can sense them already has. James swore under his breath. So we're a beacon for every power-hungry lunatic in the galaxy. Great. Before Stellara could respond, the ship's proximity alarms blared, shrill and insistent. James leaned forward, pulling up the display. A dozen red blips appeared on the screen, converging rapidly on their location. Looks like they found us, James muttered, his jaw tightening. Stellara straightened, her feathers shimmering faintly as she regained some strength. Who is it? The hunters. James shook his head, scanning the ship IDs. Worse, it's a mixed bag. Mercenaries, bounty hunters, and a few privateers. Looks like word about your little gift is spreading. The first enemy ship dropped out of hyperspace with a flash of light, its sleek black hull bristling with weapons. James immediately slammed the controls, yanking the ship into a sharp bank as the enemy opened fire. Plasma bolts streaked past them, shaking the ship with each near miss. Hold on, James shouted, pushing the engines to their limits. Stellara clutched the containment field holding the egg, her claws gripping tightly as the ship careened through space. We can't outrun all of them, she said, her voice sharp. I know, James snapped, flipping switches and rerouting power to the shields. But I'm not letting them catch us, either. The ship jolted as another salvo struck their aft shields. Sparks flew from the console, and warning lights bathed the cockpit in a red glow. James cursed, his mind racing. He needed a plan, and fast. Can you do that pulse thing again? He asked, glancing at Stellara. She shook her head, her feathers drooping. Not yet. I need more time to recover. Time isn't something we have, James muttered. He yanked the ship into a spiraling dive, ducking between the wreckage of a derelict freighter floating in the void. The pursuing ships followed, their weapons lighting up the darkness. James, Stellara said suddenly, her voice steady despite the chaos. There's a way out of this. I'm all ears, James replied, narrowly avoiding a collision with a spinning piece of debris. We need to use the egg, she said, her eyes locking onto his. It can release an energy burst strong enough to disable their ships. James's eyes widened. You want to use the thing everyone's trying to steal. That's risky. Stellara nodded. It is, but it's our only chance. James hesitated, the weight of the decision pressing on him. He looked at the egg, its soft glow casting shifting patterns across the cabin. There was something about it, something both terrifying and awe-inspiring. He wasn't sure if it was a weapon, a miracle, or both. All right, he said finally. What do we do? Stellara reached out, her talons hovering just above the containment field. I'll need to channel its energy. You'll have to keep us steady, and keep them off us long enough for me to make it work. James nodded, gripping the controls. No pressure. As Stellara began to focus, the egg's glow intensified, filling the cabin with a warm golden light. The energy radiating from it was almost tangible, like static in the air. James gritted his teeth, maneuvering the ship as more enemy vessels closed in. Whatever you're doing, do it fast. He called out, his voice strained. I need a few more moments, Silara replied, her voice tight with concentration. The enemy ships surrounded them, their weapons charging for a final strike. James's hands flew over the controls, his movements precise but desperate. The ship's shields were failing, and he knew they couldn't take much more. "Silara," he shouted. "Now would be a good time." The egg flared suddenly, its light blinding. A deep, resonant hum filled the cabin, growing louder and louder until it seemed to shake the very fabric of space. James felt the hair on his arms stand on end as the energy built to a crescendo. Then, with a soundless explosion, the energy burst outward in a golden wave. It swept through the pursuing ships, their systems flickering and failing as the wave passed over them. Engines sputtered, weapons powered down, and the ships drifted helplessly in the void. James stared at the screen in disbelief. "It worked," he muttered. "It actually worked." Silara slumped back in her seat, her feathers dim but her expression resolute. "It won't last. They'll recover, and others will come." James nodded, setting the ship back on course. "Then we need to stay ahead of them. Your people, are they close?" "They're not far," Silara said, her voice weak but determined. "But reaching them is only the first step. The hard part comes after." James didn't ask what she meant. He had a feeling he already knew. The egg wasn't just a key to survival. It was a key to something much bigger. And whatever that was, they weren't ready for it. But they would have to be. The stars outside shifted as the ship jumped to hyperspace again, leaving the disabled fleet behind. For now, they had a reprieve. But James knew the galaxy wouldn't let them rest for long. The ultimate sacrifice. The ship emerged from hyperspace into an uncharted sector of the galaxy, a void of swirling nebulae and shattered asteroids that cast eerie, shifting shadows. At the center of it all was Silara's destination, a hidden sanctuary orbiting a dying star. The structure resembled an ancient cathedral, its spires glinting faintly in the dim light, surrounded by defensive platforms and holographic shields. James whistled low as he guided the ship toward the docking bay. "This is where your people are hiding. Looks more like a fortress." "It's not just my people," Silara said, her voice quiet yet firm. "It's a council, leaders from multiple species, those who understand the stakes. They've been waiting for this moment." James glanced at her, his brow furrowed. "Waiting for the egg, you mean?" Silara nodded. "They believe it will be the beginning of something greater, a unifying force that can bridge the galaxy's divides or tear it apart." James didn't reply, his hands tightening on the controls. He had spent his life avoiding grand causes and galactic politics, keeping his head down and surviving. But now he was tangled in something far bigger than himself, and every instinct told him it was about to go wrong. The ship landed with a soft thud in the docking bay, and James powered down the engines. He turned to Silara, who was securing the containment field around the egg. "What happens if they try to take it from you?" he asked. Silara's feathers rippled with unease. "They won't. They'd know it belongs to me." "And if they don't care?" Silara met his gaze, her golden eyes sharp. "Then we fight." James nodded, sliding his pistol into its holster. "Let's hope it doesn't come to that." They descended the ramp together, the egg pulsing faintly in its containment field. A group of figures awaited them at the base of the platform. Tall, imposing beings clad in ceremonial armor. At their center was a towering Carovian elder, her feathers shimmering like molten gold. "Silara," the elder said, her voice resonating with authority. "You've returned." Silara bowed slightly. "Elder Vishara, the awakening has begun." The elder's gaze shifted to the egg, and her expression became unreadable. "Then the time has come." As they approached the council chamber, James couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. The room was vast and circular, its walls adorned with holographic constellations. Representatives from dozens of species sat in a wide circle, their eyes fixed on Silara and the egg. "The awakening has gifted us a vessel," Vashera announced, her voice echoing through the chamber. "Within this egg lies a being that could unite the galaxy or destroy it. The question is, who will wield its power?" James stiffened. "Wield it? You're talking about controlling it." "Guiding it," Vashera corrected, her gaze flicking to him. "This is a force that cannot be left unchecked." Silara stepped forward, her feathers bristling. "The egg is not a tool to be used. It is a life, a being with its own will. It must decide its path. And if its path leads to destruction," a grizzled reptilian delegate hissed, "do we simply watch as it tears the galaxy apart?" The chamber erupted into argument, voices rising in a cacophony of fear and ambition. James watched in growing frustration, his hand hovering near his pistol. These people weren't looking for unity. They were vying for power. "Enough." Silara's voice cut through the noise, sharp and commanding. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to her. "This being is my responsibility. It was born of my awakening, and I will not allow it to be used as a pawn in your schemes." Vashera frowned, her feathers dimming. "You speak as if you have a choice." Silara tensed, her feathers flaring. "I do." Before anyone could react, the egg began to pulse more intensely, its glow filling the chamber with a golden light. The air grew thick with energy, and James felt a strange pressure in his chest, as if the egg's presence was rewriting reality itself. "It's hatching," Silara whispered, her voice tinged with awe and fear. The council backed away as cracks began to spread across the egg surface. Light spilled out in brilliant rays, and the hum grew louder, reverberating through the walls. James instinctively stepped closer to Silara, his hand on his pistol. With a final, deafening crack, the egg split open, and the light burst outward, engulfing the room. When it faded, a beam stood in the center, a shimmering figure of energy and form, its shape shifting between humanoid and avian, with eyes like galaxies. The chamber fell into stunned silence. The beam turned its gaze to Silara, then to James, its voice resonating in their minds. "I am born of unity and division," it said, its tone both serene and powerful. "You have brought me into a galaxy on the brink. Tell me, what path shall I take?" Before Silara could answer, Vashera stepped forward. "Your power must be guided, controlled. Without it, chaos will reign." The being's eyes glowed brighter. "Controlled is the path to ruin." Suddenly, Vashera raised her arm, signaling the guards. "Seize it." Chaos erupted as the guards moved forward, weapons drawn. Silara stepped in front of the being, her feathers flaring in defiance. James didn't hesitate. He drew his pistol, firing a warning shot that ricocheted off the chamber walls. "Back off," he shouted. "Nobody's taking anything." The guards hesitated, but Vashera's gaze burned with fury. "You would defy the will of the council." James smirked. "I'm not big on councils." The being raised a hand, and the energy in the room shifted. The guards froze in place, their weapons falling from their hands. Vashera's voice caught in her throat as the being turned to her, its gaze piercing. "You seek to use me," it said, "but I am not yours to command." It turned to Silara, its voice softening. "You have protected me, guided me, and now the choice is yours." Silara's feathers trembled as she met its gaze. "The galaxy needs hope, but not at the cost of freedom. You must choose your own path." The being nodded, its form shimmering. "Then I shall go where I am needed." It raised its arms, and a wave of energy swept through the room. When the light faded, the being was gone, leaving only silence in its wake. The council stared, stunned. Vashera's expression was a mix of anger and defeat. Silara turned to James, her feathers glowing faintly. "You didn't have to stay," she said quietly. James shrugged, holstering his pistol. "I'm not big on running either." As they left the chamber, the weight of their actions settled on them. The galaxy had been given a chance, but it would have to find its own way. And so would they.